On today's episode of the SSPX Podcast, we'll continue our Apologetics Series by looking at one concept: justification, or how to get to heaven. How are we justified? Did Christ do all of the work through redemption? Do we simply need to believe that His infinite merits are enough, or do we need to do something? This is going to be one of the main sticking points between Protestant and Catholic theology, so Father Loop will help us to understand our own role in salvation. You can find notes to all of these episodes at sspxpodcast.com/apologetics, as well as all of our previous episodes. There as well, you can find a link to help support this project. This is free to listen to, as well as all of the resources we're posting, but if you can help with a one-time or a small monthly recurring donation, you'll be making sure that we can continue this work of producing good Catholic content on a regular basis. Now let's join Father Jonathan Loop for episode number 29 of the Apologetics Series right now. Well, Father Loop, thank you for joining us again on this next episode of our Apologetics Podcast. It is great to have you back, and we were just talking last time about the Bible and about the sources of revelation, their hierarchy, scripture, tradition, etc. Today, we're going to be talking about the notion of original sin. Is that correct?
Yes. And precisely the notion of original sin as understood by Protestants in particular, since that shapes a lot of our modern world and is perhaps the chief and underlying difference between the heresy of Protestantism and the true faith as we have it. So to understand Protestants at a deep level, this is where we would go. Even if perhaps on a day-to-day level, not every Protestant would have thought through the implications of the teachings of the founders of Protestantism. And maybe just to begin that, I think a very interesting way to do so is to give a short quote from a relatively famous sermon that was given by a Protestant in one of what was referred to as the Great Awakening in the 1740s, at that time, the American colonies. It was an effort to stir up religious fervor. And it was in the context of these great revivals and these meetings that would be occurred where people would basically be invited, as we even now hear, to accept our Lord as their Savior. And in the context of the sermon, Jonathan Edwards, talks to sinners, and by which he means effectively anybody. And he says, before somebody accepts Jesus as their Savior, effectively, a man is hated by God. And he uses some very colorful, let's say, terminology. So to quote him, he says, "The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire, and he looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He is of purer eyes than to bear to have you in his sight. You are 10,000 times more abominable in his eyes than the most hateful, venomous serpent is in ours."
Wow.
It's a charming vision, you might say. And again, you might give him the benefit of the doubt that he's rhetorically exaggerating so as to provoke people to take seriously their need to convert, potentially.
Sure.
And yet, at a deep level, this reflects a vision of man that is a fruit of the Reformation, as it's so called, really the Revolution, in which sees man as truly hateful to God. And I mean, a Catholic preacher trying to get people to take seriously their sins, to work against them, would never ever let's say, referred to man as a loathsome insect, abominable to God. Okay. And what I think would be good as we walk through this is to really see precisely how this rhetoric flows from that Protestant vision. And again, this is central. So to understand that, I'd like to quote from a document that was published in the late 1990s, in fact, in 1997, called the Joint Decree on Justification, it was an ecumenical endeavor, taking some Catholics, some Lutherans, who were trying to resolve these differences about ultimately the question of justification, and in turn, this question of original sin. And they say that one of the parts of the document says that, in fact, the very introduction, that the doctrine of justification was of central importance for the Lutheran Reformation of the 16th century. It was held to be, quote, the first and chief article, and at the same time, the, quote, ruler and judge over all other Christian doctrines. This doctrine of justification was particularly asserted and defended in its Reformation shape and special valuation over against the Roman Catholic Church and theology of that time, which in turn asserted and defended a doctrine of justification of a different character. From the Reformation perspective, justification was the crux of all the disputes. And justification from what? From original sin, ultimately. Okay. Does that make sense?
It does. So the Protestant idea, just as we get started looking at this, the Protestant notion of original sin is that original sin does exist, but they're going to see it in a very different form than what we saw, for instance, when we were back with Father McFarland, some 15 episodes ago, when we were talking about Revelation and he touched on original sin. That's going to be a totally different way of looking at original sin.
Exactly. That's a very good point. And precisely, it might be good just to very briefly review some aspects, of the Catholic teaching on original sin, just to remind ourselves what we saw, which will help, I think, put in some context what the Protestants were rejecting and what they were asserting in its place. Now, obviously the best or perhaps the most authoritative discussions are going to be at the Council of Trent, and from a point of view of theology is going to be St. Thomas Aquinas, who discusses original sin on the Prima Secundae, questions 82 and 83 in particular. And what St. Thomas, to look at him a little bit, says is that on the one hand, original sin obviously most clearly is a loss of the original justice that Adam and Eve received from God, and all what he terms as preternatural gifts. In other words, things which are not as such part of human nature, but which are in accordance with it. An example of that being, for example, the question of integrity, which is that perfect and harmonious order of all the different powers of man's soul, and ultimately that subjection of those powers to God, where you have a perfect docility of our mind to the truths that God, whatever truths God would impart to us. The will is perfectly docile to the intellect as its higher principle, and all the passions of the soul, which are still there, nevertheless are in the service of whatever man sees by his mind and chooses as good. In other words, we see that if Adam I have a work that is going to be a little bit difficult, that passion of, let's say, courage would correspond with that choice that he makes to pursue that, to undertake it, and give him that oomph, you might say, to fulfill it. And from that perspective, those all are lost. See, some of the other preternatural gifts are impassibility, the sense that we don't get sick. We would not have gotten sick in the garden, nor would we have undergone death. Because again, death is an interesting thing for a man. In a way, it's natural. In a way, it's not natural, so to speak. It's not, or it's natural because anything that's made of different parts, especially material parts, like our body, is prone to fall apart. But it's not natural in the sense that by itself, the human soul, is intended not to die. Our human soul is eternal and therefore should preserve the body in existence. So it's that God gave that preternatural gift that we would not die. Does that make sense so far?
Making sense so far.
Okay. Now, when Adam and Eve sin, they lose all those. And perhaps in a way, the chief and most important is that question of the integrity. Because in a sense, that's going to be just greater or lesser measure at the heart of the Catholic vision of original sin. And St. Thomas, at a certain point, he asks in the first article, actually, of question 82, when he's asking, what's the essence of original sin? He says that we have to understand that that original sin is a habit insofar as it is a disposition resulting from the various parts of the soul. And that's going to be important because this is going to be kind of a fundamental difference between the Catholic perspective and the Protestant. And to quote him more particularly, he says that original sin is a certain inordinate disposition flowing from the dissolution of that harmony of soul in which original justice consisted. Okay. And he compares that disorder in the soul, which is original sin, to the disorder of a diseased body, where the parts of the body are at variance with one another. Perhaps an easy example, so he would not necessarily use this example because I don't think science or medical science had identified this more specifically. But if you look at cancer, where certain cells of the body, for whatever reason, begin to multiply without any reference to what's needed, and they sometimes then impede and damage other organs or whatever, just take them over. And so you have this disordered disequilibrium within the body. And similarly, in the soul, you have these different powers which no longer are integral. They're no longer ordered, you might say spontaneously, to that highest end of man. And as a result, each in a way is seeking their own proper goals, their proper ends, without any coordination. So let's say just very simply, your stomach gets hungry. It's like, that's the only thing that matters in the world right now. And it's the belly does not serve, or in that moment, now that we have fallen, the purposes of the mind. And what can happen, therefore, is that not only that, but especially the lower powers in their pursuit of their proper goods were in a way constituted by our nature in such ways to follow them because they're more immediate. Obviously, it's much quicker thing to partake of the joy of a Snickers bar or whatever, candy you may happen to like, than to grasp the beauty of a intellectual truth. And that's deepened by the fact that we're familiar, we can say habituated from basically our infancy to follow those passions. Because when you look at a little child, that child is affected by original sin, meaning that there's not the disposition of the soul to obey reason. St. Thomas actually, because if a child, St. Thomas actually asks, would a child, when they were born in the garden, would they have come out knowing everything? Because otherwise, how are they going to obey reason? And he's like, no, they'd still have to learn, but they would have been properly disposed to follow the direction of their parents with great docility, as opposed to now. I remember a story of one of my friends who, this is a long time ago that he told me about this, but he was babysitting for one of his other friends' families. They had a little 2-year-old girl at the time, and the little girl was playing with a book, and she kind of got the book and kind of got in that position where, you can tear the book. And the guy is looking at her is like, "Don't you dare do that." Right at him, and
Yep.
that immediately. So in other words, that interaction wouldn't have happened in the state of original justice. The child like, "Oh, okay, this is what I need to do."
Right.
And so the child doesn't have that disposition to obey reason, and the first things that are active are those passions, and necessarily they get used to following them. It's just, there's no way around that. And of course, that's a big part of education, is training those passions so that later on they're going to cooperate with, as opposed to obstruct, the work of the higher powers, the will and the reason. Now, with that in mind, I think a very important important observation is that each of the powers and the appetites of the soul nevertheless remain fundamentally good. They're aimed at true goods proper to our nature, and an action which intrinsically is good, but which is out of order potentially. In other words, it's good to eat. That's actually a virtuous action. It's something that we sustain our life by, and as a result, obey God. The difficulty is, of course, is that if we follow it, out of order with what's necessary to survive. And so all of these powers, they're intrinsically good, but they're not working together. And St. Thomas says a little bit later, so in the 4th article of that same 82nd question, that with the bond of original justice dissolved, under which all the powers of the soul were contained in a certain order, every power of the soul tends to its proper movement, all the more vehemently as the power is stronger. Now, the context of that question is, in fact, or that article in particular, is original justice or original sin the same in all people? And if that's the case, then why do some people have a harder time not sinning than others? And his answer is simply, okay, look, basically, since all the powers are going in their own directions, people who have a certain bodily makeup, which are, let's say, it's going to make them more prone to a certain passion or make that passion stronger in them, well, because there's not that order, they're going to be going that much more powerfully in that direction. You kind of see that with like little kids who have a lot of energy. They just go off in that direction.
Right.
Okay. And of course, at the same time, we can, and this is something the Archbishop Lefebvre used to like to comment on, which St. Thomas does observe, is that there can be said to be wounds in the principal powers, meaning that, let's say, they do have a certain weakness in obtaining, especially when we look at the higher powers, their proper object, and for the lower powers, a harder time being subject to their higher powers. There's meaning that, so for example, with the intellect, we speak of the wound of ignorance, which means it's harder to learn, harder to retain knowledge, etc. It's not that the knowledge is not good, it's just we have a harder time grasping it. It's a little weak in its prosecution of that. Similarly with the will still seeks good things in itself, but sometimes, let's say, we're inconstant. We all have that problem. Think of our Lenten resolutions. So this will be good. Great. And something comes up and we kind of fail because of that inconstancy, that weakness, the will to persevere in what it's trying to do. And of course, with the concupiscible power, that desire, there, in a way, we're too strongly driven towards it. That's how the wound manifests itself there. And it's, as a result, we're very prone to seeking sensible goods too much. more than which is proper, more than what's necessary for our higher purpose as a man. Okay, so they're not bad as such. It's not bad to be hungry. It's not even bad to seek to be a father or a mother, in that proper sense of the term. It's just that often those passions become too directed towards their proper object in a way that's contrary to the law of God or the higher purposes of man. Does that make sense?
So it does. So generally speaking, what original sin did, if I can kind of try to sum up what you've just been saying, is, man is good. He still has the ability to seek after good. He is still made for the purpose of good, but original sin has kind of broken. There's that little chink in the link where the will, the appetites, and the intellect, there's just kind of that break there, or it's weakened, or there's kind of like a straw in a water glass where it's just slightly distorted. And so we're unable often, or apparently unable to seek after what is good all the time, or the true good all the time. It's just that it's just not available to us all the time unless we work at it and unless we develop that virtue. And that takes time and effort.
Correct. And even, and from a certain point of view, we could say that even now we seek true goods. The problem is not what we're seeking, but rather the fact that, let's say, there's not that proper hierarchy. Our nature at this point is wounded from the point of view we don't seek the proper hierarchy, even on the natural level. And all the more so, if we start considering the supernatural order. And that's, I think, actually one important qualification here is that with original sin, we also lose merit. We lose the right to receive grace, which is the necessary means by which to be united to God. So not only that's grace is, even in the original justice, is a gift of God. It's not something due to human nature as such. But now with original sin, not only is that grace, not a due to human nature, but it's also withheld as a punishment justly, because they turn away from God. And so there's that side of it as well. But even if we look just at how it affects our human nature, that's kind of what we were discussing. It's this dissolution, is the word that St. Thomas says, a dissolution of that link, of that bond by which all the powers of the soul were made through that gift of integrity to work together. And because of our constitution, that means that we're prone, especially, to be given to lower goods, especially sensible goods, or let's say flowing from that love of money, whatever. And let's say, so we can, as you were saying, work out and develop a certain natural goodness and virtue. People like Aristotle, these pagans, they talk about that. But it's a very difficult, very long process. And even if one successfully does that, can do nothing to help man earn heaven, because it's not proportioned to the end that God proposes to us.
Okay. So that's kind of our recap of the Catholic teaching of original sin, what it does to us. Could we then pivot, Father, to Protestant teaching? You kind of gave us a preview of it already, but I think the biggest difference, if I'm understanding your intro correctly, is that instead of the Catholic notion where man is still good and still pleasing to God but damaged, the Protestant notion broadly is that man is hateful to God. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes. And when we say man is pleasing to God, obviously that means as a creature, as in the sense of still fundamentally sound, but not, of course, by grace. He's not pleasing to God by grace. And as a result, is still prone to do things that'll lead to hell. But to come back to the Protestants, we can say that their vision of original sin, it's interesting reading about this. If they are logical, it's a terrible, terrible doctrine. And I think, in a way, it's one of the things behind a lot of the despair of modern man in many respects. And also the very, very sharp let's say, rejection of Christianity in many aspects of the modern world. But so I would say if we look at what they have taught, there may be four major points to grasp out what they say, and each of which will play its part in understanding this whole argument about justification, whether by faith or by works, and what that means. So in the first place, as we've really already discussed, is that in the Protestant vision, original sin makes man as such hateful to God. By nature, so to speak. And they do try, and I'll quote a passage where they do try to say, okay, there's this distinction between the nature and the original sin as such, the original sin being just this profound corruption. But in the end, it works out practically being that man as man is now hateful to God. So first, maybe passage that I think helps to see that comes from John Calvin, the author of the Institutes of Religion, and of course, the founder of the Calvinists. And he says in that work, nay, their whole nature is, as it were, a seedbed of sin, and therefore cannot but be odious and abominable to God. Hence, it follows that it is properly deemed sinful in the sight of God. For there could be no condemnation without guilt. Yeah. So man's whole nature, their whole nature is odious and abominable to God. To be a man means that you are, as such, hateful to God at this point. And again, a little bit later on, he says, the two things therefore are to be distinctly observed, that being thus perverted and corrupted in all the parts of our nature, we are merely, on account of such corruption, deservedly condemned by God, to whom nothing is acceptable but righteousness, innocence, and purity. And one other quote here, this quote's now coming from a work that was actually put together by a number of early Protestant theologians who were trying to reconcile some of the early divergencies that were cropping up. And it's called the Formula of Concord, the Solid Declaration. And here we read, and they have a long discussion of original sin, where they're trying to really hammer out what they mean by it. And there we read, and original sin is called by Dr. Luther a, quote, nature sin or person sin, thereby to indicate that even though a person would think, speak, or do nothing evil, which, however, is impossible in this life since the fall of our first parents, his nature and person are nevertheless sinful, that is, thoroughly and utterly infected and corrupted before God by original sin, as by a spiritual leprosy.
Wow.
If we think about that, the original sin is a nature sin, a person sin. So even if we don't do any actual sins, that's what they mean. If you don't think, speak, or do nothing evil, if you don't commit a single actual sin, nevertheless, because of original sin, you are evil before God. His nature and person are necessarily sinful. So when you go to confession, so to speak, it's not to say I did this or that, but I am me. Person, I am me. I'm sorry, God, for being me. Is ultimately what you could work that into if you take that principle and apply it in that way.
Can I ask a quick question, and maybe you're going to answer this,
Okay.
but just a quick rebuttal, again, just trying to be fair.
Okay.
There are, and I don't have any off the top of my head right now, but there are many, many prayers in the Catholic Church that talk about, they say things like, I am a sinner, I am unworthy before your eyes, O Lord. You know the kind of prayers that I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
That is a common theme in much of Catholic teaching, and at least in our prayers. So then how is that definitely distinct from what you're saying here, Father, where we are hateful in the eyes of God?
Okay. It's a good question. And I think in a sense, we could say that there's two answers to that. So on the one hand, typically when we have those prayers, pray for, like the Hail Mary, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Okay. So on the one hand, we're most concretely praying for mercy on behalf of our actual sins. That's the chief thing that we're praying for. And obviously, all of us, as St. Paul says, have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Which means we've all fallen into actual sin. Okay. And so that's one way of keeping that in mind, and that's important. On the other hand, at the same time, the original sin does precisely leave those wounds, that disorder in the soul, which is not taken away even through baptism. And as a result of that, we're prone to sin. We do have that, as is called typically, concupiscence, or what St. Thomas will call a little bit later, the fomes of sin is kind of a term. And that means that, unfortunately, given our condition, and particularly without God's healing grace, we're prone to sin. And to that extent can be considered, in a very loose sense of the term, as sinners in a conditional way. Okay. And nevertheless, we're not talking about something which means that every single motion that we have is as such sinful, as such. And I mean, this, we will come into this in a moment, because we can, let's say, for example, we can perform naturally good actions that are in accord with our nature, and to that extent are in accord with the will of God, even if that does not by its nature, but not sufficiently earn grace. It cannot demand grace because there's no proportion between a naturally good action and the gift of God's grace. But at the same time, and St. Thomas will say that on occasion, a man who is, let's say, making a serious effort can be well disposed for grace. And in a way, not as a debt of justice, God nevertheless can typically grant grace to those who are disposing themselves to it, to an extent. He has another long section on this in his treatise on grace, a little bit later in the Summa, in that same section. Okay. Does that answer your question sufficiently for the moment?
It does, yes. Thank you.
Okay. And so the next of the four major points that I was commenting on, I think, begins to answer that question. Okay. So we said, firstly, man as man at this point is hateful to God. His nature, his person, that nature sin, person sin, that's abominable to God, or to use that language of John Calvin. Now, the second thing is that you have original sin produces a complete corruption of human nature. A complete corruption. Firstly, that means that man's nature as such is at this point sinful. And here I'll quote from an article written by a Protestant more recently. Let me just try to pull up her name real quickly. So a Protestant named Harma Mae Smith, in an article that she wrote to explain the nature of Luther's teaching on original sin, trying to articulate from that Protestant point of view what we're dealing with. And so she says there, she actually quotes another author, a biographer of Luther, saying, so Roland H. Bainton, it's the person she's quoting, underscores this in his biography of Luther, which is titled Here I Stand. He writes, there is, according to Luther, something much more drastically wrong with man than any particular list of offenses which can be enumerated, confessed, and forgiven. The very nature of man is corrupt. The penitential system, by which he means the Catholic teaching, okay, look, If you sin, you can go to confession, gives you grace, it restores you to God's favor, etc. Because it is directed to particular lapses, what we would call actual sins. Luther had come to perceive that the entire man is in need of forgiveness. Again, to put it like you go into confession, please forgive me for being a man. Please forgive me if you, again, use that term, person sin, please forgive me for being me. I'm sorry for being me. Okay. And again, to quote once more, going back to that, the formula of concord, we read there, and first, it is true that Christians should regard and recognize as sin not only the actual transgression of God's commandments, but also that horrible, dreadful, hereditary malady by which the entire nature is corrupted, and above all things be regarded and recognized as sin, yea, as the chief sin, which is a root and fountainhead of all actual sins. Okay. Right. And a little later on, it says that original sin in human nature is not only this entire absence of all good in spiritual divine things, but that instead of the lost image of God in man, it is at the same time also a deep, wicked, horrible, fathomless, inscrutable, and unspeakable corruption of the entire nature and all its powers, especially of the highest principal powers of the soul in the understanding, heart, and will. So now that the fall, man inherits an inboard wicked disposition and inward impurity of heart, evil lust, and propensity. That we all by disposition and nature inherit from Adam such a heart, feeling and thought as are, according to their highest powers in light of reason, naturally inclined and disposed directly contrary to God and his chief commandments. Yea, that they are at enmity against God, especially as regard divine and spiritual things. So that's a longer quote. But again, to break that down, what that means is that this original sin is something really positive in man now. And in fact, this leads to the next point that I wanted to make when we say that man's nature is corrupt, that each power in particular is also affected and turned away from its proper purpose. So that, in fact, the mind, by what it's inclined to do, and the will are at enmity with God, necessarily. Whatever movement is of them is at odds with God as a result. And they do mention that, okay, look, you can have natural external things subject to reason. They can still be a certain power. But all they mean ultimately by that is that we can manipulate things around us and we can figure out how to do that. But in fact, if we take that principle that they're saying that the nature is so corrupt that everything that we seek is opposed to God, then every action that we make, every single decision we pursue is by its definition sinful and offensive to God. You think of the heart. Your fact that you love this woman, that's sinful. Ultimately. If they are, if they're logical. And again, so that means that each of these powers, so the will and the reason are directed to evil objects. Again, it's not a matter of, okay, look, they're directed to something that's proper to them, which is good for nature as such, and which, if well ordered, would lead men to God, even on the natural level, at least as far as man can naturally attain to God, but that it's fundamentally bad. And this is part of the reason, I'm sure many of us have heard some of those quotes from Luther where he attacks reason, says that reason is, to simplify, the whore of the devil. I was reading some Protestant apologists who were commenting that oftentimes it's somewhat, let's say, taken out of context in the sense that sometimes when he says that, he's trying to argue against what he views as heretics of one group in particular, like the Anabaptists, who were against all law. and people who would deny the sacraments. And so he says, okay, look, they try to reason this out, and that leads them against the faith, and that's bad. But what you can also delve into that is that reason cannot help us to explicate the faith. And if we try to use our reason, we try to think things through, it's going to give us serious problems with respect to the faith. And so we shouldn't use the reason at all. And so just one or two quotes. This is from a sermon, several sermons, actually. He says, reason is and should be drowned in baptism, and this foolish wisdom will not harm you. If you hear the beloved Son of God saying, take, eat, this is my body, which is given for you. This bread which is administered to you, I say, is my body. If I hear and accept this, then I trample reason and its wisdom underfoot and say, you cursed whore, shut up. Are you trying to seduce me into committing fornication with the devil? That's the way reason is purged and made free through the Son of the word of the Son of God. In other words, you cannot figure anything out. You cannot explicate this. You simply crush it. And in that way, by crushing it, you purify it. And then he finishes by saying, so let us then deal with the fanatics as fanatics are these who deny the sacraments, as the prophets dealt with the spiritual harlots, the idolaters, the wiseacres, who want to do things better than God does. We say to them, I have a bridegroom, I will listen to him. Your wisdom is utter foolishness. I destroy your wisdom and trample it underfoot. So you notice he doesn't say they've made a mistake. They've made, in other words, they don't have wisdom. They've erred in making a judgment under apparent reasons, but which can be accounted for. Rather, it's okay, we're going to crush reason. Okay. And another quote where he says, this from a sermon on St. Matthew's Gospel. And again, he's talking, the immediate people that he's talking about are Anabaptists, other heretics. But again, they argue, how can children believe, seeing that as yet they have no reasoning power? So it's a whole question, in fact, that later Protestants will deal with, can you have children baptism? Thus they add reason to faith. To this Christ answers, that is exactly why children can believe better. They cannot reason. For reason is directly opposed to faith. This is why you must let reason go. It must be killed and buried in believers. But these Anabaptists turn reason into a light of faith so that reason may serve faith as a guiding light. I hold that it does shine forth as smudge in a lantern. So reason is like smudge in a lantern in this case. Christ wants us to turn into veritable children if we desire to come into the kingdom of heaven. He means that as all reasoning is, so to speak, still buried in children, so reason is also to be killed in all Christian believers. Otherwise, faith has no place in them, for reason opposes faith. So ultimately, reason is so wounded that it opposes the truth of God. What it proves, so to speak, to be true is contrary to God. In a way, in a sense, that's one of the foundational, you might say, characteristics of the modern world is there is this belief that faith and reason are necessarily opposed, that they prove different things. Right. And you have to effectively either choose one or the other. Does that make sense?
It does, and it's interesting because it's you see the effects of this moving forward into the modern world, where it's you see all of these scientists who say certain things. Now I know I'm kind of diving into a hot topic issue with science, medical research, et cetera, but that is all part of the faculties and the gifts that God has given us. And so if there are good scientists who are doing good research, we shouldn't dismiss them. We shouldn't dismiss what is to be true if that comes through reason.
Correct.
Generally speaking. But you do see this tendency where it's often, well, we can't trust what they are saying. Well, that's, showing the geology or showing the age of the earth. Well, we just have to dismiss that because that's contradicting what the Bible literally says about the earth being created in 7 literal
Correct.
days. That's where you get into a lot of that issue with, especially fundamentalist Protestants.
Correct. And whether the church has looked at this very question is like, no, look, the reason can figure out the truth. And what that really means is that, okay, what truths the human mind can discern on its own are never going to be opposed to what the faith teaches. Now, there may be occasions where we get misled by an apparent reason, and we make a false conclusion as a result that may seem to oppose the faith. But all that means is that there's been an error at some point in the reasoning, and that if we go back and analyze things more closely, we'll be able to resolve that apparent contradiction. Well, that's absent in Luther. Yeah, so 1 or 2 more quotes. And again, just to show this is a consistent overall vision that's pretty constant through these thinkers. So again, from this article by Harmame, apologize, Miss Smith. She says that the Reformed interpretation would emphasize that spirit and reason are bent away from God as well. And so a conflict between desire, concupiscence, spirit, and reason would be meaningless as a barometer of sinfulness before God. In other words, being sinful is not, oftentimes we'll say that one of the aspects of sin is that it's opposed to reason. We act in a way that's contrary to reason, which goes back to that idea that our lower faculties are meant to serve our reason, which is aimed most directly at God, and is through which we attain to God, even supernaturally, by the virtue of faith. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. And we'll see, again, that's from the Catholic perspective as opposed to the Protestant understanding of it. But here, that doesn't mean anything. To go against your reason is not as such sinful. It destroys fundamentally that ability to think about, what actions are good or harmful, and therefore, let's say, to that extent, pleasing to God. And then again, John Calvin, once more from the Institutes of Religion, he says, "For our nature is not only utterly devoid of goodness, but so prolific in all kinds of evil that it can never be idle. Those who term it concupiscence use a word not very inappropriate, provided it were added. This, however, many will by no means concede, that everything which is in man, from the intellect to the will, from the soul even to the flesh, is defiled and pervaded with this concupiscence. Or to express it more briefly, that the whole man is in himself nothing else than concupiscence." So in other words, it's not just a deregulation of our powers, but our powers themselves are bad and defiled, pervaded with concupiscence.
Right.
So what I would suggest then is 2 more points. Maybe these are just really conclusions, so we may not necessarily need to spend so much time on them. But the first of them is that this corruption of man's nature and of his powers produces an active inclination to sin. So again, going with Miss Smith or Mrs. Smith, in this work on the Romans, Luther also works out the sinfulness of believers. One of the reasons Luther was so radical is related to his second assertion that an active sinful nature still operates in a believer, and that therefore a person can be simultaneously saved and a sinner. So you're both at one and the same time pleasing to God and hateful to him. It's interesting. We'll see how that can happen. Okay. And a little later on, she says that the Reformed definition of sinful nature would not be a loss of control over human desires, but rather the active sinful bend in every human desire. Think about that. Every human desire. Young man falls in love, sin. You want to help somebody, sin. There's something actively sinful in everything that you choose to do. And to quote then Luther in his commentary in the letter to the Romans, he says, "But what then is original sin? According to the apostle, it is not only a lack of good quality in the will, nor merely the loss of man's righteousness and ability. It is rather the loss of all his powers of body and soul, of his whole outward and inward perfections. In addition to this, it is his inclination to all that is evil, his aversion against all that which is good, his antipathy against light and wisdom, his love for error and darkness, his flight from and his loathing of good works, and his seeking after that which is sinful. And then just lastly, John Calvin again says, next comes the other point, that this perversity in us never ceases, but constantly produces new fruits. In other words, those works of the flesh which we were formerly describing, just as a lighted furnace sends forth sparks and flames, or a fountain without ceasing pours out water. Hence those who have defined original justice as the want of original righteousness, which we ought to have had, though they substantially comprehend the whole case, do not significantly enough express its power and energy. For our nature is not only utterly devoid of goodness, but so prolific in all kinds of evil that it can never be idle. It's just amazing. It's like everything you do, everything you're inclined to do is sinful and hateful to God.
Right.
Everything.
And everything that you want to do is like he said, pouring out of us like a furnace of sin. Everything, every desire, every action, everything that it's a tough way to live.
Correct. Yeah, it breaks one's mind, ultimately, I would say. Because it flies in the face of really just common sense. And at the same time, it really and deeply, as I think we'll see a little bit more when we look at this question, justification, it really and deeply undermines the sense of God's justice and decency towards us. And just as a kind of a conclusion on this, looking really quickly back at St. Thomas, he makes a point in that question 82, on when he's talking about the essence of original sin and saying that, look, original sin is not a habit in the sense that it actively inclines one to an action. So, in other words, it's not actively inclining us to sin as such. And that's where he was saying, as we began, where he was saying that it is a habit in the sense where you have this disordered disposition of all these parts that aren't working together, okay, and therefore is likely to mess up because of that disjunction of these powers. And that's important, whereas for the Protestants, it is it's a habit in that way, so to speak, which is inclining us actively to act sinfully and against the law of God. Now, the last point, this will lead more directly into the question of justification, is that original sin is fundamentally not removed by baptism. So, for example, to quote Ms. Smith again, she says that original sin, according to the Belgic Confession, so some Belgian Protestants who made this profession, corrupts the entire nature of man. And they say, this is a quote of this confession, as a root, it produces in man all sorts of sin. It is therefore so vile and abominable in the sight of God that it is sufficient to condemn the human race. It is not abolished nor eradicated even by baptism. For sin continually streams forth like water welling up from this woeful source. And the point there being, if all of our sinful actions are a direct consequence of our bad nature, then how do you account for them after you've been baptized? Well, the conclusion that imposes itself is that the original sin is still there. And that's going to be what we'll see, that man can be at the same time justified and a sinner. Okay. And together with this, that means that man cannot cooperate with grace. And that's a huge point. Because man's will, in fact, I'll begin by saying this, quoting another Protestant, a gentleman named John Piper, who I think is somewhat prolific. And so he begins a little passage, he quotes Luther, saying that this is my absolute opinion. He that will maintain that a man's free will is able to do or work anything in spiritual cases, be they never so small, denies Christ. This I have always maintained in my writings, especially those against Erasmus, which he's referring to a work called On the Bondage of the Will, which is a back and forth between Erasmus. Now, this Piper comments, he says that he doesn't mean that the will is inactive. He means that wherever it is active in faith and obedience, God is decisively acting, creating, and fulfilling the acts. In other words, man is not cooperating. If man's will is basically being made to act a certain way by God in that instance. And this is consonant with a very famous quote from Luther that is in fact in that passage on the bondage of the human will, where he says this: thus the human will is placed as a sort of pack horse or beast of burden in the midst of two contending parties. If God hath mounted, it wills and goes wherever God pleases. As the psalmist says, I am become as a beast of burden, and I am ever with thee. If Satan, though, hath mounted, it wills and goes wherever Satan wants. Nor is it in its own choice to which of the two riders it shall run, or to seek its rider. But the riders themselves contend for the acquisition and possession of it. There's no choice involved. Either God's in charge or the devil is. And fundamentally, the only decisive thing is whether God wants to be in charge of your soul or not. So we're very much on the edge of, what will be very clearly articulated in John Calvin of predestination.
Right. That's exactly where I was going to go with it, because then, so you have no free will, you are evil by nature, and so if God decides to step in and just move you like a chess piece, then he can, and that's good. Otherwise, Satan is moving you through the rest of your life, and you're evil.
Yep.
That's it.
Yep.
Huh.
And here I'd like to go back just to kind of, well, actually, no. I'll quote one thing from John Calvin that's along these lines as well. So Calvin, again, in the Institute says, hence it follows that part in which the dignity and excellence of the soul are most conspicuous, therefore the intellect and the will, has not only been wounded, but so corrupted that mere cure is not sufficient. There must be a new nature. So man's intellect and will it's not a matter of curing them, healing them. We speak of gratia sanans, healing grace, and gratia elevans, elevating. He says that doesn't exist. There must be a new nature. Basically, God must create something entirely different. And to finish this section before concluding overall, I'd like to go back to that joint declaration on justification issued in 1997, again by some Catholics, some Protestants, some Lutherans. It says, according to Lutheran teaching, human beings are incapable of cooperating in their salvation because as sinners, they actively oppose God and his saving action. So in other words, you're so corrupt, everything in you, every spontaneous thing welling from inside you is opposed to God. And as a result, you cannot cooperate with him at all. So Lutherans do not deny that a person can reject the working of grace. When they emphasize that a person can only receive mere passive justification, they mean thereby to exclude any possibility of contributing to one's own justification, but do not deny that believers are fully involved personally in their faith, which is affected by God's word. But ultimately, if you look at what they mean by that, it's passive justification. I do not contribute. I do not choose. And if, let's say, after justification, I can be said to choose good, it's because God's acting in me. Not because I, as such, through the nature I've received from him, am assenting to that and choosing it. Okay, and we'll see obviously the implications for this question of works. Okay, and clearly as a result, well, in fact, just to conclude, This doctrine regarding original sin fundamentally underlies that controversy surrounding the question of the relationship of faith and works. What we're seeing here, I think, already is going to point in the direction how Protestants are going to understand works. And why, for example, they're going to claim effectively that Catholics are Pelagians, meaning that Catholics teach that you yourself somehow work out, you merit salvation without God, ultimately. So it's to return to Jonathan Edwards. Again, that spider that's hanging over this pit of hell is never fundamentally changed. God simply chooses not to throw it in. That's salvation. Okay? But that fundamental loathsomeness, God's never going to love the spider. He puts the spider on the side of the vast pit of fire. It's still going to be a spider. It's just not been thrown into this combustion. And in a way, it's also along the lines of that famous passage that's often ascribed to Luther, which I haven't had time to verify. I might try to do that before the next recording, that man, a redeemed man, is a pile of dung covered over by snow. That covering of snow is the grace of Christ. But fundamentally, you are still dung. And again, even if those exact words aren't used, it's the tenor of his teaching. So, yes, with that, I think we can probably bring this to a conclusion, unless you have any questions before a little later on coming back to justification.
No, I don't, and that is fascinating, and I'm interested to kind of take the next step down this rabbit hole and kind of see where this goes, because and I think you gave us a nice teaser that this is eventually going to lead to predestination, that man has no willpower because his will is effectively dung, which, I mean, to be fair, sometimes my willpower is dung, but not all the time, hopefully.
Well, and I think the thing is, it's never simply done. St. Thomas says that in each particular circumstance, we have sufficient liberty of will that we can avoid sin in each particular instance. The difficulty being that obviously, oftentimes, we're really kind of, let's say, crowded with a lot of different temptations at once, and given our weakness, we're not able to fight them all. So it's impossible for any man globally to avoid sin. And oftentimes, and that's one of the unfortunate aspects of our modern world, is our will is terribly weak. Firstly, by that wound of original sin, and then secondly, by our habituation. Oftentimes, as when we're young, we're kind of trained to give way to our impulses of the moment, which is really our passions, and the whims, whatever strikes us. And so we have a hard time choosing a path or something to do, and a hard time persevering in that choice. Because let's say we face an obstacle, we get discouraged, it becomes less immediately appealing to persevere in it. And for any of those responses, we give up. We don't see it through. And then the overall atmosphere of the world in which we live militates against developing the will. It's in fact precisely a lot of these social media sites, they're designed to destroy willpower, because they're preying on that impulsivity that we have, trying to draw us in with novel things, notifications and stuff like that. So as soon as it's like Pavlov's dog, ding, check my phone, or whatever.
Right. Father, that was fascinating. Thank you for taking the time to go through it all with us, and looking forward to the next episode where we're going to dive even further. So thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Apologetics Series on the SSPX Podcast and on our YouTube page. Please consider subscribing to the YouTube account and the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever fine podcasts are found. And please consider leaving a rating or a review on this podcast. This will help to make sure more people can find this podcast and discover the beauty and the truth of traditional Catholicism. Until next time, thank you for joining us, and God bless you.